and of course those that are also watching this call at another time. We really appreciate that everyone is extremely busy at this time of year, and we're really grateful that you've chosen to spend an hour of your day with us. My name's Irene Scott. I'm the Humanitarian Director at Internews. For those of you that might not have interacted with Internews before, we're an international NGO and we empower people worldwide with the trustworthy, high quality news and information they need to make informed decisions, participate in their communities, and to hold power to account. We work with communities, local media, aid agencies, and local responders in over 100 countries around the world. And we support them to understand their role in the information ecosystem during a crisis. We firmly believe that people preparing for and responding to the impacts of disasters and crises need more than physical necessities. They need information, timely, local, relevant, reliable information in preferred languages, ideally, of course, um, and via channels they trust, and to make informed decisions about their lives. They need to be part of the efforts to create an inclusive and safe information ecosystem that enables them to participate in decision making. So, today we're going to introduce you to our new protection guidelines that aim to help responders to understand, identify, and respond to information related risks in their contexts. But of course, a spot of housekeeping to start the call. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Leah. So, of course, standard housekeeping directions coming from us. Please, if you can, mute your microphone while you're not talking. I would definitely say throughout the presentation, there's no need to wait. If you have a burning question, please do put it in the chat, and we'll be happy to chat and answer questions as we're going along. But do stay tuned, of course, for a discussion at the end. We've allowed quite a slab of time at the end of this to make sure that we have time for a lively discussion, and we would love for everyone to get involved, to ask questions, and to challenge us and give us feedback on what we've produced so far as well. You can see there on the screen there is a Mentimeter QR code and a number. We might just go to the next slide and you'll get a better view of that. I'd encourage you, if you can, to please join this Mentimeter, either using your phone, of course, to scan the QR code, or you can go to menti.com and put in the code there, 22679815. We'll give you a little bit of time to get that started. We'll be using the Mentimeter throughout this presentation to ask you questions. We would love for you to be involved in the interactive process throughout the presentation, because I'm sure people are joining at many hours of the world around there, and we want to keep you engaged and awake, and of course involved in what we're trying to share here today. Okay, if everyone has joined, I'll also put you'll notice actually that code will stay at the top of the slides today. So we'll just move on to the next slide. And if you haven't had the chance to join yet, you still have the code there for you. So what is the Community Voices for Better Protection project, and what are these guidelines that we're launching today? So my colleague Leah is going to take us on an in-depth tour through these guidelines, but the project aim, what we were really trying to do was to understand the risks that communities in crisis face when they're seeking and sharing information, and of course to create accessible resources for humanitarians, civil society, and media. The aim was very much to better understand these risks, to be able to delve deeper into the concept that I think we all understand and know, that communities impacted by crises, and humanitarian crises in particular, face more barriers in accessing quality information to inform their decision making. So they can be exceptionally vulnerable to the impacts of misleading information, mis and disinformation, and the online and offline threats to their safety based on low quality or malicious information. We also know that protection and other relief agencies sometimes lack practical, human centered resources to access and mitigate these risks, to incorporate protection risks related to access to information into their protection mainstreaming activities as well. So what we were really trying to do with this project is to respond to this gap by developing some really protection focused information and community engagement tools and guidelines that might be able to improve stakeholders' ability to properly assess these risks in their work, in the information ecosystems in which they're all existing in, and to design interventions from a community-led data and safe access point to ensure that the affected populations are able to share and access information between humanitarian responders, between themselves, and of course with the host population as well. If we can go on to the next slide. I'll give you a really brief overview of this project. And of course, as I said, my colleague Leah will go into depth, but this was an 18-month project. The entire project was really designed with a community lens, and this was really incredibly important to us throughout this process. So this meant engaging the affected communities from the development of the framework and the questions that we have in the toolkit to, of course, the data collection, the design of training for community members and local media, and ultimately working to give those communities a space to voice their information needs and preferences and the risks that they identified in their communities, as well as developing community-driven solutions to address some of these barriers and protection risks that were identified. So we were able to build these guidelines by using 3 pilot locations in the Philippines, Iraq, and Mali. And with our community-led approach, what we really tried to do was hire research teams in each of those 3 locations that were directly from the crisis-affected community and were incredibly diverse teams. So we weren't looking for researchers with top shelf degrees from the capital city who had quite a lot of research experience. What we really wanted to do was make sure we could develop and test these tools with community-based researchers. So we had younger and older community researchers. We had community researchers with varying levels of literacy and digital media access. So it was really important to us to make sure we had this diverse range of inputs into the tools and approaches. Also to prove the point that you don't need a big fancy aid organization always to use these tools. They are really designed at that community level for the community to be able to use for their own uses as well. And if we can go on to the next slide. So an important part of this project were that we were guided by a global advisory panel of protection experts. Internews as an international aid organization is quite new in the protection space. We've been working to, strengthen information ecosystems for 40 years, but in terms of protection work and working specifically in this space, we wanted to make sure that if we were creating global guidelines that we hope other stakeholders adopt in many different humanitarian contexts, that we really got as much information and guidance from as many protection agencies as we could. So this, as you can see on the screen there's a number of different logos, of course, from the leading agencies who really supported us throughout this process over the last 18 months. And I have to say, we absolutely appreciate the immense contributions of all of these agencies and all of the individuals from the agencies, plus some independent consultants that don't have logos who also contributed. I would say I don't want them left out of this. But I really appreciate throughout this time their honesty and their expertise that they lent to this project. I think that was really critical for us to develop guidelines that are hopefully accessible and hopefully something that many different agencies are able to pick up and run with and incorporate into their practices. But I'd like to, at this stage, acknowledge and hand the mic over to one of the most important agencies on that slide. This project was funded by the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. And I'd like to hand the mic to Cele De Gruccio from BHA, just to say a couple of words and let us know what it was about this project that intrigued them and why now.
Great. Thank you so much, Irene, and greetings to everyone on this official launch. It's a pleasure to be here representing BHA, USAID, Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. I'm part of the Safe and Accountable Programming team that leads efforts to ensure that beneficiary safety, accessibility, and our accountability to them are central to all humanitarian activities, operations, and programs. Now, we call this safe programming, and it's about understanding who's at risk in an emergency, what those risks are, and doing everything in our power to prevent and mitigate those risks. For us at USAID BHA, this ranges from comprehensive approaches to accountability to affected populations, to robust measures for PSEA, to ensuring that humanitarian programs are implemented in a safe manner by integrating protection mainstreaming and GBV risk mitigation measures. And of course, we know that one of the key ways that people can protect themselves is through the power that comes with accurate, timely, and responsive information. We all know that access to information is a right, and that information is aid. We've seen time and again how critical it is for crisis-affected communities to be able to access reliable, verifiable, and trustworthy information that helps them make informed decisions and minimizes their own protection risks. We've also seen the devastation and the damage that can be caused by the dissemination of misinformation and disinformation, and how these can put affected populations at greater risk, exacerbate vulnerabilities, and impact trust in and credibility of humanitarian actors. Through this Community Voices for Better Protection project, the tools and resources developed directly supports efforts to encourage safer access, creation, and exchange of information within affected populations and between the community and humanitarian actors. It helps actors consider how to prioritize critical components of meaningful community engagement, with an emphasis on information protection analytical framework, risk and mitigation strategy development, localization, community-driven solutions, and enhanced collaboration and coordination efforts with a diverse range of stakeholders. And this includes actors perhaps we never considered traditional, but who are indeed extremely essential information actors, such as the local media. So for BHA, this project was of particular interest because it directly contributes and aligns with priorities to support humanitarian responders in collective approaches to accountability and inclusion, as well as promoting meaningful participation of community members in all stages of programming. We see this project filling a necessary gap in these efforts, and it's resulted in the production of practical, tangible guidance and tools for humanitarian actors, including non-protection actors, to implement protection-related accountability and inclusion measures within their programming. So for BHA, we see this work as a step in moving the needle forward and achieving impactful progress. We're incredibly pleased to join the official launch of these tools and resources. And we'd like to recognize the critical work that Internews has put into the development of this tool, as well as the incredibly consultative process that has been undertaken. Recognition must, of course, also go to the members of the project advisory group and the peer reviewers who contributed so meaningfully and substantially throughout this process. So thank you all for the time, efforts, and expertise which were essential to the development of these quality tools and resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Much appreciated. And of course, we appreciate the support you've given us and the guidance throughout this whole project as well. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Leah Krivchenia, who's going to take you on a deep dive through the guidelines and give you an idea of who they're for and how to use them, and of course, how to access them as well. Over to you, Leah.
Hello, everyone. As Irene said, I'm Leah. I'm really happy to be here with some of you that I know and some of you that I don't. Those of you who know me will know that I'm very excited about protection, and so I'm particularly excited to have come on board to Internews at a time that this project was happening. And I have the pleasure of being the one to encourage participation through our Mentimeter approach. So hopefully you're all ready. I know we're all in different time zones, but just want to start by getting a little bit of a sense of who's in the room. So you can see the Mentimeter on the screen if it all works well, which is always a question. Answers start to come in. The reason that we're asking this question, and you'll see sort of the related one, is that one of the, I think, really interesting things that has come out of this project is the work that has gone in bringing together different frameworks and approaches and technical expertise and backgrounds, right? So we have mass of protection expertise in all of these different areas and subspecialties. We have the decades of experience that Internews and other organizations have around information ecosystems, community engagement, accountability. And one of both, I think, the challenges, but also the unique and interesting things about this project has really been to figure out how to bring together these areas of expertise. So we've got a lot of protection people, I know it's a technical term, on the call. And I'm going to move on to the next slide to get a sense of who else is here. But a lot of the work that went into this in terms of the research and consultation at the field level, and then of course at the technical level, is to bring together these different frameworks and pieces of expertise. So we've got a few information person. I don't know if that's as much of a technical term. All right, so it looks like we have a mix, which is great actually, and I think you'll see why as we go through. And this is a great question. I'm curious to see the answer to this. I feel privileged to be able to say yes, though I don't know how to do that while I'm presenting, so I won't put it in. Great. All right, we've got some combo folks. That's excellent. And I think our hope for these guidelines is that we will have more of these, right? Is that we are hoping that we have the ability to create and sustain more actors within our ecosystem who feel like they are working on issues of information and protection and where they intersect. So I'm going to apologize in advance for this very busy slide here, but I just want to give a quick overview of the guidelines and what they look like. So there are four modules within the guidelines. We are going to dive a little bit deeper into module 3 and a little bit deeper into some of the sort of overarching concepts, but we're going to cover all of the modules. Module 1 is really just an introduction and a guide. I would totally recommend, if you're sort of interested in that overview, start there. It really looks at the tools, it looks at how to use each of the other modules. Module 2 really dives into safe and accountable programming and goes into what are the ways of working and factors that we need to make sure that all of our programming, that whole range, is safe and accountable related to information provision and access to information. Module 3 is where we get into the protection analysis and where we present the protection analytical framework based on information, the IPAF, the Information Protection Analytical Framework, which is also a little bit, I think, overarching. And module 4 is a module that's specifically targeted to media and local media as a really key stakeholder in this work on protection and information. You'll see around that some of the core annexes. So we have some assessment templates, tools for assessments and research that feed into the analytical framework, some focus groups tools targeted at different target groups, key informant interviews, household survey tools, including things that can be added on to existing efforts at assessment or protection monitoring, the analytical framework itself, and then some training tools on protection and information, which we're hoping to also expand in the future. And you'll see, I'm not going to go through each of our little use cases here, but we wanted to sort of demonstrate that we hope that these guidelines can respond to a number of different use cases. So we want them to be usable to local media who might be interested in engaging more deeply on a particular protection issue in their community. We want them to be useful for civil society or local media actors who just want to make sure that their community engagement or information sharing and developing strategies are safe and accountable. We want them to be useful to humanitarian actors that are working on either protection assessments or broad multi-sector assessments on community engagement work. And so we really want this to be something that can be used for in-depth technical work, as well as a sort of broad way that all of us can improve our engagement with the information ecosystem, and how can we support that to become a safer ecosystem for communities. So we are going to jump into some of the core sort of concepts that have come out through this work and that we sort of put through in the guidelines. Why do we need this? I love this. This is like very cheesy, but I think that it will ring true to, I think, many of you, but what came through really clearly in the pilot countries and in the research work that was done in this project is that information can save lives. Information can provide people with ways to make decisions about their own safety. It means that they can access services or safe spaces or geographic locations, whatever people need to help themselves be safe. But information can also put people at risk, right? If that information is inadequate, if it's not enough, it is not accurate, if it's not timely, if it's not trusted, or specifically denied, disinformation and misinformation can also put people at risk. Information can create new protection risks or exacerbate existing ones. So we're really coming at this with wanting to look at both sides of the coin. How can we proactively support protection outcomes by looking at the information piece, as well as how can we mitigate the risks that might be there related to information. And so we just have a number of examples here. Providing information to support access to services can lead to positive outcomes, but that might also put people at risk due to geolocation on social media, depending on how it's done. Making an informed decision on whether to leave one's home or how to leave one's home, but being at risk due to misinformation that might be circulating about those safety questions. Finding safe passage, being at risk due to that sharing of personal information in those community security efforts. Looking at sort of documenting abuse for justice and redress and to mitigate that harm, but being at risk due to that process. So we really wanted to make sure that we're coming at this from both sides and looking at how to then contribute to both of those aspects of this. And please, I know I'm sort of running through a lot. Raise your hand, put things in the chat. Please feel free. We're a small group, happy to have this prompt discussion if anyone is so inspired. So I'm going to go a little bit through the IPATH. This is in module 3, but I think it's an important analytical framework for really understanding those connections between protection risks and the information ecosystem. First of all, the information ecosystem, many of you on the call, I think, are very familiar with this concept. This is a diagram that Internews uses. When we talk about the information ecosystem, I mean, this is a little bit of a truism, but the fact that it's an ecosystem is a really important thing. It's really this interconnected network. We're looking at various sources, channels, and platforms. And we're looking at how those lead to the creation, dissemination, and consumption of information in a particular context. We are interested in this from both the supply and demand perspective, as you see, and there's layers within this. So when we're talking about this information ecosystem, it's really something that we want to make sure is understood in its complexity and understood in its contextual nature. So understanding the context-specific ways that information is created and travels in the place that you're working is a really crucial grounding in being able to understand how that relates to protection and protection risks. And Internews has a lot of tools on how to better understand this information ecosystem, and you'll find links to a number of those in the guidelines. The other sort of core framework that we wanted to bring into this is protection risk, and this will also be familiar to many of you on the call. So we're looking at protection risk being the actual or potential exposure of people to violence, coercion, or deliberate deprivation. And of course, when we're looking at this protection risks, we are also looking at the risk equation and all of the components of that protection risk. So threat, vulnerability, and capacity, and you'll see that come through in the analytical framework. So this is, again, one of the many sort of starting points that we came to this process with. The next thing I want to talk about is information-related protection risks. So this really came through, and a lot of our sort of thinking on this was refined through the pilot research that happened in these 3 countries, as well as that engagement with other actors. I don't know if we have anyone on the call today, but I do just want to also sort of shout out the Global Protection Cluster for their work in sort of recognizing and including these information-related protection risks in their work on protection analysis. And I think that's been a really useful collaboration and something that we're hoping to continue to work with to really look at that sort of broad uptake of an understanding of these within the scope of the broad range of protection risks that we see in the context that we work in. So we're really looking at sort of 2 sets or categories or buckets of risks. We're interested in the denial of access to information, so that deliberate deprivation of information that people need. And we're looking at disinformation, misinformation, and rumors. One of the things that I think is really important about these and important conceptually, but then that has come through really clearly in these contexts that we're looking in, is that these two risks really influence each other and can create quite a difficult spiral. So denial of access to information makes it very difficult for people to verify information and therefore creates more space for deliberate or unintentional circulation of false information. On the other hand, the proliferation of disinformation, misinformation, and rumors makes it difficult for people to verify and identify accurate information, and therefore creates even more barriers to creating, sharing, and obtaining accurate information. So what we can see is how these things in the context that we work in, and I'm sure that in the context that you work in, that these things can lead to a bit of a spiral, and so we're interested in sort of interrupting them at different places, but it's going to be important for how they link together when we're looking at this analysis. The other sort of key fact, and we'll dive into this a little bit more. Oh dear, wait. There we go. Okay, sorry. So in addition to denial of access to information and disinformation, we identified 3 categories of consequences that these risks tend to lead to. And we'll look at some examples of this a little bit later on. One consequence that we see is contributing to the spread of further misinformation and rumors, which can then, again, is a bit that spiral, but can also have a whole set of humanitarian consequences, both related to protection and otherwise. Another consequences that we see is these risks can create or contribute to other protection risks, either that already existed or that are new in a context. So that's another really important analytical piece, and there's some tools in the guidelines to help analyze other protection risks that have information or the denial of access to information as a contributing factor. And then a third consequence that we see is that it create or exacerbate barriers to accessing public and humanitarian services, which again, won't come as a surprise to, I think, anyone on this call, but that's a really common one that we see, that the impact that this has on communities is that they're unable to access services that they need and are entitled to. So we'll come back to some of those details. I'm going to do a little bit more participation. I'm not going to go through this in huge amounts of detail. Obviously, it's all in the guidelines, but this is the IPAF based on the Protection Analytical Framework developed in recent years, I suppose, now by IRC and DRC and the Global Protection Cluster. And what we did was take that protection analytical framework and its pillars and pull out the pieces that are really related to the information ecosystem. So this is an analytical framework that can be used to understand the protection risks in a context that are related to the information ecosystem and to understand the factors in that information ecosystem that are unsafe, undignified, don't provide meaningful access. So we have the context pillar, understanding what this is, a lot of where that information ecosystem analysis comes in, as well as the way that communities interact with it and what sort of risks come out of it, what harms are created through that information ecosystem. Then we look at the threat component and what these information related threats are, understanding the motivations, understanding where and why and how those actors are, to see if there's any possibility for mitigating or for changing those behaviors. We're looking at the vulnerability aspect or the effect of the information related threat. And so looking at really what is that impact on communities, who is vulnerable to that particular threat, whether it's targeted or not. How can we make sure that we're reducing those vulnerabilities as we go along and understanding the characteristics of that community group or individuals that are affected. And then, of course, I think a really crucial component is looking at the existing capacities to address that threat. And so this is really looking at community capacity at the individual, household, family, and community level, and looking at what existing mechanisms already exist. I do want to just spotlight in this capacity section that I think one of the things that came through really clearly in our work for humanitarians is that we often overlook the media and local media actors as a piece of this capacity, particularly related to protection. So one of the things that came through really in a really interesting way in this work is the, I think, lack of trust between humanitarian actors and media actors, but also one of the things that came through in some of the sort of roundtable discussions and research that we did was that these groups have really unique and complementary ways of understanding and thinking about protection and information. And there's huge potential for greater collaboration to really lead to protection outcomes. And so that's, I think, as a capacity, is a really important piece to be looking at, is what are those existing community capacities for the creation and sharing of information. I'm going to pause there. Actually, I've been talking a lot, and unfortunately, I'm going to be talking a little bit more, but I just want to pause there and see if anybody has initial questions or comments or anything. That was a lot of sort of content that I blew through fairly quickly. Anyone that want to dive in on any of that? It's okay if not, also. Okay. I'll keep moving forward, but please feel free to raise your hand or throw any questions or comments in the chat as well. So we're going to do a little bit of a dive into each of the three modules. And again, I'm just warning you that this is where we're going to ask a little bit for your participation. So module 3 is where this information protection analytical framework comes in. The assessment tools are included as annexes, and those are really tools designed to help anyone who wants to use them do that community-based information gathering, use the analytical framework to then develop a protection analysis of the information ecosystem. A few things just to note about that came through in the research that we did. One, as Irene mentioned, we did find that we had really great success in using extremely local and sort of hyper-local research teams, which was really great. That was something that we really wanted to sort of test, is, are these tools things that are able to be done through the use of slightly non-traditional research teams, which I think was a great outcome, and hopefully demonstrates that the tools contained in this guidelines are hopefully applicable for the sort of broader humanitarian community, but are also applicable and usable by civil society, by local media at that community level. The other thing that I was going to mention about this is that from a protection perspective, it was quite interesting that when you ask people about their information needs, it actually led you to protection risks quite quickly. And I think for those of us that work on protection and understand that it can be quite difficult to engage communities on some of those protection issues, they're difficult, they're sensitive, and there's lots of reasons for that. But it was quite interesting to see how quickly, actually at the community level, people linked those information and protection issues and challenges. So that was another thing for me that was quite interesting to see come out. Oh, great, we have a question. Framework guidelines to look at protection issues across the triple nexus. That's such a great question. I mean, interestingly, I think a lot of this is really applicable across that nexus, and I think Internews works across that nexus because we have some very strong non-humanitarian work as well. And interestingly, some of the contexts that we used for this were places that I think you saw some of that come out. So Iraq, for example, right, already sort of transitioning into some of that, I don't know, nexus environment. I don't know exactly what to call it. So it is true that we use the humanitarian sort of framing of protection and a lot of that language, but I do think that a lot of these ways of working, and particularly around that coordination with civil society, that coordination with local media, actually is quite applicable across the nexus. But I think it's a really interesting thing to continue to test. So I think that's one of the things that as we roll this out and use it ourselves and hope that other actors begin to use it, I think that's going to be one of the things that will be really interesting to see what comes out of it. Great question. Any other questions or responses to that? Thoughts on the nexus? So the analytical tools here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a scenario that is fake, but based on a sort of accumulation of the various research that was done that came, essentially, this is the kind of information that we were able to get from the use of these assessment tools. The kind of protection analysis that came out of their use, I thought was really interesting. So the point of the IPAF, of course, is to understand these information-related protection risks, understand the associated other protection risks that are related to information, and therefore think through what might some strategies be to address or reduce or mitigate those protection risks. And so we're going to do a little exercise on that today. I do apologize. I am going to read this to you because I know it's probably a little bit small. And then I promise that'll be slightly less talking from me. But then I'm gonna ask you to tell me what we're gonna do about it. So it's gonna be fun. So country A has faced humanitarian crisis for more than a decade, and the security situation continues to worsen. Those conditions are heavily impacting the media industry's ability to circulate information and hampering community broader access to information. Conditions are particularly dire for IDPs who lack the information needed to make informed decisions about return to their homes, which is, I think, a familiar situation for many of us. The tense security situation leads to self-censorship by communities in need and information providers. Journalists are afraid to report on the worsening security situation out of fear of reprisals from government as well as non-state actors. Government funding to local media was drastically reduced, and there is increasing pressure for patriotic coverage of local issues to maintain the funding. Armed groups are present in IDP sites and the surrounding areas. IDPs censor themselves and avoid sharing updates about local conditions to avoid backlash from these groups. They also use coded language to talk about certain topics on the phone or within the sites. Regardless, people still feel unsafe sharing information. Violence and discrimination often target the most marginalized among IDP communities. Women are often intimidated and harassed following humanitarian distributions and are sometimes forced to give up aid in order to preserve their own safety. Out of fear of retaliation and being removed from distribution lists, they prefer to keep these practices silent when organizations conduct satisfaction surveys and distribution monitoring. There's also information circulating online, which negatively targets displaced ethnic minority communities, further impacting social cohesion within those communities. These dynamics not only impact people's access to aid, but also limit the spread of needed, accurate, and reliable information among social networks, both online and offline. There are also disinformation campaigns which circulate. Many of these campaigns are aimed at influencing opinion about international actors, including humanitarians. The government remains silent in response to these campaigns and has restricted the information environment through expelling some international agencies. In addition to disinformation, IDPs receive rumors and false leads regarding the security situation in areas where they're from. Lacking accurate information, some IDPs have been harmed by armed groups when returning home. While some locally relevant security information is available from international sources, it is often reported in English and is only accessible to a fraction of the community. For its part, the government makes no efforts to provide accurate information on security. The humanitarian community's capacity to provide information or push for accountability is limited by recent government restrictions on aid. To make matters worse, local media do not report a high level of trust in NGOs. They feel they're not taken seriously, and that collaboration only occurs when it serves the interest of NGOs. As a result, people tend to trust their relatives and social leaders in their community, but even local leaders mention difficulties in accessing information as they face similar threats as other communities, making this approach limited in its effectiveness to overcome information gaps. So this scenario really does exemplify, I think, some of the information that in our pilots we're able to get from the use of these tools. And I think you can see like the richness of the analysis around the protection risks, as well as the issues around the safety of the information ecosystem and those links. So I think for me, and certainly coming into this project, I was really impressed at that level of nuanced analysis that came out of these research projects. So the color coding is based on the IPATH in the guidelines itself. We wanted to demonstrate sort of how that analytical framework can be pulled out to create sort of narratives about these protection risks and information related protection risks. And I just wanted to point to a couple of things. So in this case, focusing on that sort of information related protection risk of disinformation, but we also wanted to highlight the other protection risks and protection threats that emerged related to this. So, you know, as I think is really common when we're looking at protection, it's never just as simple as looking at one issue, but actually you get a really sort of nuanced and networked understanding of these different risks and threats. So we see some protection risks around violence and violence against journalists and media who don't follow the government or non-state armed actors narrative. We also see violence directly against civilians who wish to share information about the security situation, as well as civilians who act on inaccurate misinformation and choose to move based on that. We see coercion, humanitarian actors forced to restrict information publicly, as well as coercion against civilians in terms of being forced to give up their assistance, and also I would argue coercion around movement, as well as access to a lack of access to information. And we see deliberate deprivation in terms of deliberately depriving people of access to accurate information, especially related to the security situation. I think there's actually more in there in terms of pulling out these protection risks, but just to give you an idea of the sort of robustness of this kind of information that it pulls out. And then we also see, going back to that sort of framework around the impact of these information-related protection risks and the consequences, is that we see a lot of that. So we see denial of access to information. So again, that cycle of disinformation and denial of access to information really exacerbating each other. We see an increase in misinformation and rumors, which then can lead to all sorts of challenging outcomes. And we see the direct exacerbation of other protection risks, including attacks on civilians and civilian objects. So I think you sort of see that gamut of how those information-related protection risks have consequences that really sort of, I don't know what a good metaphor is, that really sort of leap out and can compound other humanitarian and community level challenges as well. Now, is it? Okay, now it's your turn. So what should we do to mitigate this risk? I mean, this is really the point of this analysis, right? Is to think through what are the ways that these various risks are either triggered or caused or exacerbated, and what are the responses that might be necessary. So I'm hoping that some brave people will start to put in responses in the Mentimeter. And I'm just going to speak a little bit to how we approach this in the guidelines. I think, you know, all of you will be quite aware that there's not going to be a cut and dry set of responses that you can always do. The information ecosystem in each of these places that we looked at and each of the places that we all work is quite specific and needs to be understood in a context specific way, as well as protection risks are also need to be understood and analyzed in a context specific way. So in the guidelines, what we approached is to try to present some ways of thinking about responses and some framing questions and things to think about when doing that response. So the analytical framework breaks it down into these components, and each of those components can have a response that can contribute to the reduction of that risk. No ideas? Nobody has thoughts about how we might address some of those? I know I went through it really fast. I could call on people also. I'm not above it. Great. Find trusted information providers to channel fact that exactly. So, you know, can we actually have an information response that directly provides better information, work with civil society, local media to provide better information, find out who or what people trust, exactly, spread information through sources people trust. Definitely. So one of the areas of responses that I think we're going to see in all of these scenarios are sort of information responses, if I can use that non-technical term, right? Ways to directly address the denial of access to information. Any other thoughts? What about, like, I don't know, protection responses, right? Like, not to sort of build that in. Build capacity to identify accurate information, absolutely. Looking at sort of issues of media literacy or digital literacy. Language issues, I think, comes out as well. That's a great one. Any other thoughts? Yeah, make sure you find a safe way to share information with the most vulnerable, right? So there was some stuff that came out in that analysis of who in particular is vulnerable to the bad information that's coming through. I think that's a really interesting point. So it's, again, that really nuanced piece of information that it might be a whole community, but it might be that there are particular groups or individuals that are particularly vulnerable to these threats. Absolutely. I'm going to move on soon just because we're going to run out of time, but give it another minute to see if we have other thoughts. I think one of the things that has come through for me, at least in looking at this, is that, you know, as the analysis really covers a whole host of information ecosystem challenges, as well as protection challenges, as well as other issues in these places, it's also really clear that the response and the mitigation of these efforts is going to have to be looking at a number of different responses, right? So we might have some very direct information responses. We might have some very clear, I think there, you know, in this example, There were clearly some issues with the way the humanitarians did community feedback. So there might be some direct responses there to reduce those risks. There might also be more quote unquote protection responses. So maybe there are some community protection efforts in terms of early warning systems or in terms of developing relationships between community members and authorities in terms of supporting that information access that might come through a protection program. There might be responses that have to do with access to services and that have to do with provision of services. That through this analysis, what we're really seeing is that it also requires a level of collaboration around these issues among different agencies with different levels of expertise. And so that I think is a really key lesson for us coming out, is that, we want to make sure that as we move forward with this as Internews and as we work with other organizations that are moving forward with this, that we're really thinking about these in really a collective and collaborative way. Okay, I'm gonna maybe skip these actually because we're running out. I have some other little activities around the consequences of information-related protection risks. But essentially, I think this is clear that there's a variety of consequences from different sets of protection risks, but we have some good examples of this in the guidelines for you to look at. And I'm going to jump into module 2 and talk a little bit about safe and accountable programming. This is, the reason I sort of started with the IPAF on this is that analysis, I think, really helps with this module as well. So really looking at ways of working, what are our responsibilities in contributing to a safer information ecosystem, but of course that also requires some of those analytical questions to be answered about what the specific risks in a particular information ecosystem are. In module 2, we go through, however, some different frameworks for looking at what safe, dignified, and meaningful access to information actually practically means, sort of breaking down each of those components and having a set of guiding questions for you to use in terms of thinking what are the things that we need to be tracking and understanding and assessing about safe, dignified, and meaningful access to information, also linked again to the assessment tools, which can really help get those answers from communities. We also use the protection mainstreaming principles and have some guiding questions underneath that. So looking at participation, looking at safety and dignity, looking at accountability, looking at meaningful access to make sure that we are in our information provision, our community engagement programs, that we are making sure that we are engaging in a safe way, that our ways of working are also not exacerbating or creating other risks. And then there's a component here that I think, again, is quite cross-cutting. We're looking at effective coordination between civil society, local media, the humanitarian community, and government. And so this is, again, another thing that came through really clearly, that not only does that analysis really need to be joint, but that coordination between those actors is really what's going to move the needle on some of these risks that communities face. So how to think about coordination with those different groups. We also have, as a tool, a safe programming assessment template that you can use for a project that looks at both the benefits and the risks for all stakeholders. And I do really want to emphasize, I think one of the things that we often see is that the risks, sometimes we really focus on the risks and we actually don't focus on the benefits. And so we want to make sure that we're really identifying those and then identifying mitigation strategies to make sure that we can support and maintain those benefits of a particular intervention or activity or program, while making sure that we're reducing the risks for stakeholders involved. So it's a particular tool that I think is useful in the guidelines. And I'm going to hand over now to Irene to just say a few words on module 4, and then we'll see if there are any other questions. I think that's mostly me done talking, so you can all breathe a sigh of relief around that.
And I promise I won't talk for too long. So module 4 is really designed for journalists and media workers and content creators who are working in humanitarian contexts with vulnerable communities. And I know looking through the list of people that are on the call at the moment, there are some of you on this call that do work regularly with media in various contexts. But I think, we here at Internews, we definitely see media as being an information first responder in a crisis. They might not necessarily be seen as part of the humanitarian system or a traditional humanitarian actor, but quite often media, especially hyperlocal media, are the first that are on the scene, collecting information, collecting community perspectives, and elevating that through their own channels and their own ways. So what we wanted to make sure we did with this module was to support those directly reporting on people impacted by crisis when they're interviewing photographing, filming, and to provide some recommendations to ensure media practices don't further contribute to the protection risks that the community might already be facing. So we're really looking at targeting this particular module towards those local journalists, less so international, well, although they are also relevant, less so international journalists that are flying in and then leaving, but really to those journalists that are not only interacting with this crisis affected community, but at the end of the day will stay and support them and to support their information needs over some time. And I think what we found when we were creating this module and when we were going through our 3 pilot locations was that there was quite a high demand from local media who were very aware that there were risks that their communities faced. They might not call them protection risks, but they definitely knew that their communities faced risk. And they definitely wanted more support to understand how they could link in with protection actors and, importantly, how they could be mitigating any of these risks in their own reporting practices to ensure that they're not further harming communities. So it's an area where we would love to be doing more work in supporting media to help them balance that need between their need to, of course, report on the crisis and bear witness and show their community and the world what is happening in their particular context, but also making that calculated risk equation, which is informed by the potential impacts that their reporting and their process of reporting could have on vulnerable groups and individuals. And we have a number of examples that sit in this module, but I think one in particular I would give. Would be from Afghanistan, where, of course, for media, when there was, there have been several announcements of people that initially fled Afghanistan when the Taliban took over Kabul, fled into Pakistan and other surrounding countries, being sent back into Afghanistan. And of course, the media felt that they were doing their duty by standing at the border and taking photos of people as they were being, escorted back into the country or transported back into the country. For media, that of course they see that as bearing witness and showing the world what is happening. But ultimately, what they were doing in that particular moment was also significantly increasing the risk towards many of the people that were coming back in, who were people who feared political persecution and other kinds of persecution from the Taliban. So basically, broadcasting their faces for everyone to see who was coming back into the country and to send up a big warning flag that, would then potentially put them at risk. So we think about these different environments where humanitarians and media are interacting and may have similar aims at the end of the day of wanting an informed community, but maybe different approaches and different risk mitigation strategies. So we wanted to make sure that there was a module that was really written in the terms that media use, maybe not using protection language or humanitarian jargon so much, but really using media language, which is just everyone else's language, so that they had something that was really accessible and something they could pick up from and learn from. And we're hoping to roll out some more training based on this next year as well.
I think another thing that came out in this is that, humanitarians also need to take more seriously that local media actually have really strong contextual understanding and analysis of the protection context. And again, they don't use our language, they don't sort of use that analytical framework, but that actually there was a lot that was really added to the analysis when you brought those different stakeholder groups together in terms of that sort of protection analysis of the information ecosystem. And I just want to respond to Jessica as well. Totally agree. There's that whole sort of threat component in the IPAF, which I think is really crucial. And we do know that humanitarians often sort of struggle with that component of protection risks. And I think, yeah, exactly, sort of engaging with, working with security actors or peace building actors, sort of advocacy policy work, humanitarian negotiation, whatever those activities look like. Yeah, addressing that threat component is a really crucial piece. We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to see what other questions or comments people have. And feel free to raise your hand or just come off mic and speak or type.
And maybe, I have a fear of dead air personally, so maybe I'll fill some dead air, but do feel free to interrupt me. I wanted to make sure that we said as well that, of course, this isn't the end of the guidelines. It's not a launch and forget process that we're aiming to go through. We've spent the last couple of months actually doing individual launches in all of the countries where we've been working, along with some really tailored training for different groups in Iraq, Philippines, and Mali as well. And beyond that, next year, we'd really like to be able to take these guidelines guidelines one step further. Of course, sharing them further, making them more accessible to protection actors, to other humanitarian actors, civil society, and local media, but also finding other ways where we can make these tools more accessible, perhaps through using some digital training methodologies and other approaches. So we would love to keep building on these. And if you read these and it sparks a thought for you, or some passion or an interest, or if you see a gaping hole, we would definitely love to hear from you. Our contact details are there on the screen at the moment. We definitely consider this as an open discussion and an area where there's a lot more room for growth and for understanding, both on our side and I would say also in the industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're certainly hoping to integrate these into our own programming and build out new sort of program areas as well. And so also really, always interested to talk about what those sort of program level implementation looks like. I think there's so much more learning to be done. Any other comments or questions, feedback?
Well, that's okay. I know not everyone is comfortable asking questions in open forums like this, but I did want to thank everyone for coming along. As I said earlier, I know we have a lot of demands on our time at the best of time, but especially at this time of year, I do feel that everyone is more stretched than usual. So we really appreciate you taking the time to hear about this for the last hour, and of course for the people that are watching this recording in the future. Appreciate you putting aside some time and your cup of tea, hopefully, while you learn about this. Do reach out to us if you have questions. We would love to continue this discussion. And otherwise, wherever you are in the world and whatever time zone you might be in, have a nice day, a nice evening, a nice morning, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.